Well, next we're heading to Merseyside. Beth, you were at Turf Moor on Sunday. It was another win for Liverpool, but another late win. Are you seeing that as a sign of champions, or are you slightly more concerned that they're not getting the job done early?
I'm seeing it as a sign that I'd like them to score a bit earlier, so my match, all my work could be done a little bit earlier. But funnily enough, Arne Slot was actually asked that question in the press conference afterwards, and he said a bit of both. And I think that probably is the right answer. I think, the old adage is that champions always find a way, and that is what Liverpool have done so far this season. Even when they've not been playing well, they've managed to find a way, however improbably, to win games and to win games against really tough opposition as well. The first game was at home to Bournemouth, who I think they're in fourth at the moment, have started the season really, really well. Then they were away to Newcastle United, which is always a tough place to go. And obviously with the wider context of everything around Alexander Isak, made that even more difficult. And then Arsenal as well. Burnley, obviously maybe a team that you would expect them to beat, a little bit easier. But I think, even going back, I remember, I think when City won the title in 2018, 19, they won that game 1-0 thanks to a goal from Aguero. So quite often those games prove quite tricky for the top teams, because Burnley, they're not afraid to just sit back and defend as much as possible, and they defended admirably yesterday, I thought. So yeah, I think that there's encouraging signs to take from the fact that they've not been at the best, and yet they've been able to go on and win these games, and to be top of the table after 4 games is really impressive. However, it isn't sustainable to win games like that for the entire season. I hope that's not what happens anyway, because I'm not sure that my heart rate could take it. But yeah, I think that there are concerns. I think certainly in the first 2 games they looked defensively like there were some vulnerabilities there. I think they tightened up a little bit defensively. Against Arsenal, they were they did well at limiting Arsenal to very few clear chances, but the flip side of that was that creatively they looked to be lacking a little bit of a spark, and that was sort of the same against Burnley yesterday. So they're still far from being the complete package, but I think when you consider it's still so early on in the season, they're still yet to blood the British record signing, that there are a lot of positive signs. And I think the fact that they are, they're not afraid to play right till the final whistle and dig as deep as they have been digging is a positive, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like that maybe Liverpool haven't been given the credit that they deserve for their start of the season, because I appreciate that when you win games so late that's going to be immediately what you go to. They're only scoring it's taking them time to break teams down, but they've won away at Newcastle, they've beaten Arsenal at home. They're 2 massive games in terms of, I know it's too early to talk about title race and things, but massive games in terms of the season. Obviously, yes. Sunday at Turf Moor, it was Mo Salah who got the winner. I think it's fair to say that he's been relatively quiet at the start of this season, perhaps not delivering what he did for Liverpool last season. Where do you sit on that debate? Do you care that he's not getting as involved if he's popping up with the winning goal, albeit with a penalty?
Yeah, I mean, I think last season he was just absolutely outstanding. Obviously he scored more goals in his first season at the club, but I think in terms of his overall game and his passing and his ability to bring his teammates into the game, I think last season was probably his most impressive season in a Liverpool shirt. So I think anything short of that would be criticism, and particularly when you consider, he's just signed a bumper new 2-year contract. So yeah, you can't argue with the fact that he's been quiet. Yesterday he did very, very little, but then again, he goes and he manages to score the winning goal. And, I turned to someone next to me when he stepped up to take that penalty, and I said I'd have given it to Dominic Szoboszlai to take, because his last 2 penalties were, they were both in friendlies, but he missed both of them. So, I think the fact that he was able to, after having quite a difficult afternoon, to be able to sort of blank out all of that noise and just put it away as well as he did, just shows the mentality that he has. And ultimately that's why Arne Slot leaves him on the pitch. Again, that was something else that Slot got asked about yesterday. Do you ever consider taking Mo Salah off in games when he's not being effective? And he said, maybe sometimes I will do that. But the message from him was very much, as long as he's on the pitch, he's always got a chance of doing something, whether it be from the penalty spot, whether it be setting up a teammate, whether it be scoring the winning goal himself. I think he's just such a talismanic player for Liverpool. And I think, we've seen him have dips in form before. Even last season, he had a little spell at one point where he wasn't quite at his best. I think you still can tell very much that he's trying to get to grips with his new teammates. I think, that chemistry that he had with Sadio Mane and Roberto Firmino was incredible, and it's quite rare to get that level of chemistry, consistently in the way that those three did. And I think, even with Darwin Núñez, who's obviously gone to Saudi Arabia now, I think despite the fact that he was unreliable in front of goal, him and Mo Salah actually had a really good relationship. So I think he's now trying to get to grips with all of these new players. And I think as well, one thing that I feel with Mo Salah this season, I think out of all of the Liverpool squad, the difficult circumstances over the summer, obviously with losing Diogo Jota, I think that's maybe affected him more than a lot of players. He said it in the aftermath of that he was scared of coming back to Liverpool. He never thought he'd be scared of coming back to Liverpool, and he was. And, we saw him have that really emotional moment at the end of the Bournemouth game where he just stood and cried essentially in front of the fans. And I do think that has maybe weighed quite heavily on him. And, he feels maybe as one of the senior players in the group that it's maybe on him to be a real sort of pillar of strength for that squad. And I do think that has taken its toll a little bit. But yeah, I'm not overly concerned. I think, we've seen enough to suggest that, he's still capable of doing brilliant things. I think in pre-season he looked very, very sharp actually. So I think maybe it's just a case of he's finding his feet and gelling with his new teammates a little bit.
Another player that there have been questions about is Florian Wirtz. I mean, are we just looking at a young player coming to terms with the pace and the physicality of the Premier League, or is there a bigger problem there, do you think?
Well, I think, when you sign a player for upwards of £100 million, you expect them, regardless of their age, regardless of all of those things that you said, and the fact that, they're bedding into a new league, you expect them to come in and be have that wow factor immediately. And he probably hasn't had that. He's come in and probably Hugo Ekitike, who was almost, I think in some conversations has been a bit of an afterthought because of all of the stuff about Alexander Isak. But actually he's come in and done incredibly well. He scored 3 goals in his first 3 games. And I think it, in a way, that hasn't grabbed the headlines in quite the same way. I am not overly concerned. I think, you look at what he's done so far, you look at the way that people talk about him and the way that, obviously he had 3 clubs desperate to sign him, probably more than that, but obviously Manchester City, Bayern and Liverpool were the 3 sort of main clubs in the picture. And I think, the history dictates that at some point he's really going to turn it on. And I think, it's about for him. He said himself during the international break, the Premier League is very different to the Bundesliga. He's still adapting to that level, to the demands, to the physicality. I thought actually in the second half against Arsenal, he was really, really good. I thought in the second half yesterday, you saw him become more influential as the game wore on. And I also think, Liverpool's midfield hasn't necessarily been particularly settled at the start of this season. Ryan Gravenberch was out for the first game. He was suspended. Alexis McAllister's been in and out. Dominic Szoboszlai has been going to right back. So I think, Liverpool haven't had a real sort of settled front sort of 6, I guess, over the first few games of the season. And I think maybe, again, once he's able to sort of consistently get a run alongside a group of players who he can sort of find a level and a connection with, that's when we might start to see the best of him.
And then another new signing in Alexander Isak. Obviously, we didn't see him at Burnley on Sunday. I've seen Arne Slot sort of talk about how they're going to try and ease him in. And what do you think the plan is for Isak? Obviously, Liverpool's schedule is quite hectic now going forward. When do you think we'll see him? And what do you think Slot has in mind for him as he kind of tries to bed him in?
Yeah, well, Slot spoke at length on Sunday about his plan for him. I think, there was obviously a lot of disappointment amongst fans and online that Isak wasn't involved at all. I think a lot of people expected him to be on the bench. And, there's an argument that having him there, certainly in a game like yesterday where Liverpool obviously needed a goal late on, it would have been nice to have him as an option to bring on. But Arne Slot's point is that, he signed a 6-year contract. He's here for 6 years. I mean, whether he fulfills those full 6 years, only time will tell. But, he's here for the long term. He's not here to be rushed into 3 fixtures in the space of a week. And Arne Slot said, yes, on Sunday that, he's far away from being able to play 3 games a week, which is obviously the schedule that Liverpool have got at the moment. He said, he could have put him on the bench on Sunday. He could have brought him on for 10, 15 minutes at the end, but he feels like that's maybe not the best way to build him up. He feels like the best way is to allow him to train, and then he can maybe play a more sort of consistent solid spell. He mentioned sort of he might be able to play 45 minutes against Atletico Madrid. So I would be surprised if he's not involved at all on Wednesday. That said, he said if he plays 45 minutes against Atletico Madrid, don't expect him to play 45 minutes against Everton on Saturday because his body's not ready for that yet. So I think Slot is very much being guided by, you know, how fit he is, how his body is. I think the last thing that he wants, the last thing that Liverpool want is for Isak to be rushed in and then, you know, he's out for 6 weeks with an injury that he picks up. So I think it's all about trying to manage his workload. But yeah, I imagine against Madrid on Wednesday is when we might see the first glimpse of him in a Liverpool shirt.